Hi everybody, welcome to Intro to Music Technology. My name is Dana Parker, and this is the first module that we're going to go through, and all the modules will work exactly the same way. I'll go through the information, and at the end of the module there'll be a very simple quiz. You'll have a week to turn in the quiz, and you can take the quiz as many times as you wish, and you may also use your notes. Most importantly, I don't want this to be a hard class, but I do want this to be valuable for you so you can use this information in the future, of course. So the first things first, what is sound? One of the most valuable things for me was to understand the importance of air in recording. The further I put the microphone away from a piano or a guitar amplifier, the further away the source is going to sound, of course. If I take that microphone and I put the microphone closer to the source, closer to the piano, closer to the vocalist, it's going to make that source sound louder if I'm recording that source, of course. So the understanding of air and knowing how air works within the recording world was very, very valuable for me. So within our book, of course, and then I'll give you all this information, so don't feel like you need the book. But as you look here, air is made up of molecules and the spaces between the molecules. And so the way I like to think of it is with microphones. There is a technique to miking certain instruments. Maybe going too close might not necessarily be the way that certain instruments sound the best. And understanding the way that air works within the sound source really will make you a much more professional engineer. Now, elasticity is very simple, a property of air that causes air molecules that have been compressed together to spring apart. So the way I've got here, I've got the clap, for example, and then you see as all of that air is basically escaping from your hands. Another example is blowing up a balloon compresses the air molecules inside the balloon, and when the balloon is popped, the air molecules spring apart. Another thing is compression. Now, we're not talking about a compressor. Compression is different. Compressor occurs when air molecules are pushed together by a sound source. So examples, pulling a guitar string and letting it go causes the string to move forward and compresses the air in front of it. Rarefaction, on the other end, is the area where there are fewer molecules than before because of the compression. So the way that this works is very, very simple. And many of you have probably already seen this before. We get compression waves. They're a series of compression and rarefaction that propagate or move through the air. So as you can see here, the more that we take this waveform, and if we get this closer, let's say up to the top here, as you can see my cursor, that's going to be louder, isn't it? The top side is going to be the compression side. The bottom side is the rarefaction side. And you'll see that there's this center line that's cutting that in half. So as you can see here, then this is going to be one wavelength that will be 360 degrees that basically creates a very simple circle. There's nothing to really memorize or remember. It's actually one of the things I like to point out is that you'll be looking at waveforms as you're working in any DAW. One of the things within our distance learning is, at least of what we're doing here, I can't assume that everyone has a DAW. So what I'm going to do is show you what I'm doing here. But if you've got one, hopefully you'll be able to turn in some of these assignments. I'll have very, very simple assignments that you could turn in, and then we'll be able to go back and forth, and I can give you some some pointers or things like that, or hopefully we'll just be able to have a track that we can put out. But if you don't have a DAW, don't worry, you're going to be just fine. You can always turn in something to me. We'll be able to work with that. I'll basically just make sure that you're under the understanding of where we're going. And so right now what we're talking about are these compression waves. As you can see here, I've got a very simple guitar. In that guitar, as I double click here, you can see these waves. And now in the middle, this is set. But if I wanted to, I could easily turn this wave up, couldn't I? Now if I did that, you see there, wouldn't that be very, very loud? So most of us in today's modern world, if we saw a waveform like that, we know that we would be very, very afraid to utilize that, or to hit play, of course, because we know it would blow out our speakers. And vice versa, if I was to turn the waveform down, we would note that maybe potentially we would have to do something with that signal source. Maybe the microphone was too far away or something like that. So looking at our waveform as engineers and as producers is our power. We can see our waveform now in this particular case is right kind of in the middle of the road, right? Now, if I was to turn that all the way up, of course, I really don't have a threshold. You can see that's going to pop and it's going to click, it's going to sound terrible, and it's going to be very, very loud. So one of the main things that we can talk about here early on, just to get started, is simple. our compression wave or our waveforms, we can see now. Back in the 70s, the 60s, you could not see a waveform. You would be listening and you would be seeing a meter, and you could see that meter go to the red, but you couldn't necessarily see it. I feel that we have a true fast pass to be able to see our waveform. So hopefully you'll utilize that. So as I go back here, you see, as I could see that waveform, I can see if there's a problem or end or not. So I really do find that that's very, very powerful for us. One of the other things we like to look at, of course, is what is sound? So at this point, right? Sound is essentially compression waves created by a vibrating body. So what are some of these vibrating bodies? For example, guitars. Of course, I'm a piano player, keyboard player. So pianos, violins, these are stringed instruments, of course. But, we always talk about, what about keyboards? Well, I'll get to that, digital keyboards, right? So guitars, pianos, violins, we're looking at a stringed instrument, having strings that vibrate in order to create its sound. And then, of course, those instruments will have a piece of wood or in the case of a soundboard, to be able to hopefully create a really nice vibration or a really nice resonance that we can record and hopefully sounds world class, right? Another aspect would be mouthpiece. A mouthpiece, for example, with brass, woodwind instruments like sax, trumpet, trombones, clarinets, flutes. In order for us to get this sound source, we have to have a mouthpiece, of course, and then we have, our bell, or, like a trumpet is made out of brass. Saxophone, same thing, of course, flutes, obviously. But without the mouthpiece, of course, we really have no way in order to create the sound source. Vocal cords, another way, of course, right? Another one that I like to look at, of course, coming from, the electronic, world, as far as EDM, for me, that's kind of the main game for us. Electronic oscillators. And now with electronic oscillators, of course, it's not necessarily acoustic per se, but in this particular case, we're looking at creating simple waveforms that are digital. And it's very easy to utilize this, especially when we're looking at, so many different software instruments that can give us access to this. So I always like to point out electronic oscillators. That's what we're using in order for us to use these really cool synthesizers like Moogs and things like that we all hear in dance music, right? Simple waveforms, digitally created. And then with that, if we were to look at these waveforms, you'd be able to see them and they would have a shape to them. So for example, this would be a sine wave. And if you saw a square wave, the square wave is it's really that simple. It just looks like a square basically, right? But in this case, looking at sound just to, get started. These compression waves created by a vibrating body, we look at strings, a mouthpiece, vocal cords, or electronic oscillators. This is how we create sound. This is where our source comes from. So what is resonance then at this point? And then all of these sound sources have a very special quality to them. And so they resonate, or they have a certain resonance to them. And so with that said, you've probably heard people, in certain movies, for example, if you've heard Spinal Tap, obviously it's kind of a funny movie, of course, but they say, the guitar has a certain sustain. And that's kind of what they're getting to. And the idea is that, for example, a Gibson Les Paul, these guitars are, they could be literally $50,000 to $100,000. But the point is that they have a certain resonance, they have a certain timbre or a certain quality that they create because of the wood, because of the strings, everything. Same goes true for a piano or a violin, you'll see. So what is resonance? When the initial sound wave is passed through the body of an instrument in order to modify its pitch and timbre. So for example, the body of a violin or a guitar is a resonator for the sound waves created by the strings. So here is a Gibson Les Paul. And this would be an example of, one of the old school ones from, back in the 60s, for example. This easily could go for upwards of $50,000 to $60,000. If you're ever in Hollywood, go to Guitar Center, the Hollywood Guitar Center, and then go all the way to the back to the vintage area and look at some of these guitars, and you'll see it's staggering, some of the price tags and some of the guitars that are way up in the ceiling. You'll love to see them if you're a guitar player, for example. I also like to look at violins. One of the things that I note here, this is, one of the rarest violins. In this case, this is a Stradivarius. But a Stradivarius violin, some of these could go for upwards of, in this particular case, it's for sale for $45 million. Some have recently sold. I just saw one for sale for $16 million. It just sold. But these are, very sought after. Most of the time, museums own these violins. The main thing about this, this is from the 1700s. This violin, for example, has a certain timbre, a certain quality that no other violin has. And that's why, obviously players, this is kind of, essentially world class. There's very few instruments that will ever reach this price tag. But of course, the Stradivarius, from the 1700s, it is always in the millions of dollars, and usually through a museum, and that's a big part of it. It's timbre. And so as you can see, I get pretty excited about the quality of certain instruments. For those that I'm sad that we're not on campus, but if we were on campus, we have a Steinway, and one of the things I like to do is bring us all around the piano, and I like to show you the soundboard of the Steinway and the strings and the harp and how everything is made in order to create its tone or its resonance. And a Steinway, for example, could cost, again, another $100,000 or so. Do we need that type of an instrument in order to create quality or to create a hit? Of course not. Remember, I'm coming from the dance world, so one of the things I like to do is I like to sample instruments like this, and I like to use them electronically, right? So, for example, let's just look at a waveform of a guitar that's been recorded. And as you can see here, I've got this waveform of this guitar. It's a very simple electric arpeggio. And if I hit play, you can see that it's just a loop that I've got here from Logic. So for example, if you've got GarageBand or if you've got Logic, FL Studio, or even Ableton Live, you're going to have a lot of these different loops that you can pick from. And then you can create this timbre, this resonance from somebody that's actually recorded it for you. So you don't necessarily have to have it. I have to tell you, I use it quite often as a DJ, as a producer. I can't always get in a drummer. I can't always bring in a guitar player or a bass player. So oftentimes, I might bring in a loop, and I might try to perfect it as best as I can and get the timbre that I like from something that's been pre-recorded. So for example, here is our electric guitar. Not too bad, right? One of the things I like to point out is I can call up this little channel EQ. And this channel EQ is basically just going to allow us to be able to get a little bit more low end or maybe potentially a little bit more high end. One of the things I'm going to point out here throughout the class is we as humans hear 20 to 20K, to 20,000 hertz. So essentially we as humans, we hear the low end at 20, and we hear the high end at 20K. Now essentially that's pretty much the range of our human hearing. One of the things I like to point out as an engineer is that a piece of gear like this channel EQ, which can be found in Logic, for example, under EQ, if I analyze the timbre or the resonance, you can see here, this is the makeup of that guitar, and it's showing us that it's basically a lot of mids to highs to the middle range. And then as far as the low end, there's a little bit of low end, but not much. Let me show you what I mean as this is analyzing. Interesting, isn't it? So now we can see the timbre or the resonance of the instrument that has been recorded or of what we've recorded. Very, very powerful, and I find that to be priceless as far as production. Back in the day, again, we had to just simply listen to it and do the best that we could. Now I can actually analyze it. I can actually see what's going on. So here I've got this acoustic strum, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Let's just analyze the timbre and the resonance. So as you can see in this case, there's a lot more low end going on, right? And then as far as the highs, not as much as that electric. So that should spell out exactly where maybe that will fit in the mix, maybe what we could do with effects, things like that. The sky's the limit, but it definitely gives us our options, and it tells us exactly what that sound source is. Here's what a violin would look like. So let's just simply check out this violin, and I will analyze it for us. Look at all the highs and the high mids, but very little lows comparative to what we just saw in the other sources, right? So a violin, you can see where that would definitely fit within the frequency range. And let's look at a piano. Now, as you'd imagine, of course, because with a piano on our left hand we're playing bass and on our right hand we're playing the treble, There's going to be a little bit more low end on a piano, right? And obviously it's there for us. As you can see, we've got our mids and our highs as that's set. Of course, if I play any higher on the register, we're going to be able to see that too. And so as you can see, the instrument will always give you access to your range as well. So for example, on a piano, if you've got 88 keys, you'll be able to play high notes and you'll be able to play low notes. But let's say, for example, if you've got a keyboard that only has 1 octave or 8 notes, you'd only be able to play within that frequency range. So with that said, as you can kind of see here, we've got our waveform as that each waveform is set. But most importantly, what we've done is we've analyzed the timbre and we've analyzed the resonance to see exactly what we might utilize within our track or within our mixes in the future. Very, very powerful for us to be able to see exactly what's happening within that timbre. It's priceless as far as I'm concerned. Now, one of the things we also like to point out, and early on especially, is the importance of our ear. Remember, if our hearing goes at this point, we can't necessarily get it back, so we want to be very, very careful. And one of the things we like to point out is exactly how we're perceiving what we're perceiving as engineers, and maybe some of the things that I like to do. So one of the things we point out, of course, is that human ear allows us to hear compression waves and can be divided into 3 basic parts: outer, middle, and the inner ear. And so I've got a very simple diagram here for you. And as you can see, we've got our outer cartilage and our outer ear, and then we've got our middle ear, of course, where we've got the canal, and then our inner ear where we've got the cochlea. Now, one of the things I like to point out, of course, as far as the outer ear, consists of the pinna and the ear canal. The pinna is the flesh on the outside of your head, and it helps us locate the sound source and slightly filters the sound. So one of the things I like to point out about the pinna is that if there is, let's say, for example, even as I'm talking now, just put your hand over your ear. If you move that, or if you change that, or if something happens where I've had a friend that had some damage to the cartilage on the outside of his ear, you can't localize where a sound source is coming from. Localizing a sound source is very important for us as engineers. For example, as you can see here, I'll play back that piano. I can move that piano all the way to the left if I wanted to. Vice versa, if I wanted to place that piano all to the right, I could do the same thing through what's called a pan pot, as you can see here. You see where it says left and right? So we could go back and forth between that sound source, but that's exactly what we're talking about as far as our cartilage on the outer ear. That localization is very important as far as mixing, because sometimes you're going to have a sound source to the left, sometimes you might have a sound source to the right, sometimes you want it in the middle. So if we have any skewing as far as our cartilage is concerned, we won't be able to localize our sound source. And so in this case, just listen to the importance. So just imagine if you had anything wrong with your outer ear, with this cartilage, maybe potentially you wouldn't know where someone's coming from. So for example, my friend, if someone was yelling at him from a distance, he wouldn't know what direction they were coming from. It was confusing for him. And so that localization is very, very important, especially as music producers. The ear canal, or the auditory canal, is the length and shape of the ear canal and emphasizes frequencies between 2,000 and 5,000, middle to high pitch range. Again, the ear canal is the length and shape of the ear canal, and it emphasizes frequencies between 2,000 and 5,000. Why is that important? Well, do you remember when we were going back here and we looked at that violin, for example? Remember 2,000 and 5,000. That's what we're talking about here as far as our frequency. So 2,000 to 5,000, you see the violin is in that high pitch range, right? And so that ear canal is set to emphasize those frequencies. So us as humans, this is basically where we hear best, basically right about this source. So for example, maybe potentially if we're yelling at somebody at a really low voice, that's probably not the best way to yell at someone, right? Now, 2,000 to 5,000, that's another thing too. When we do vocals, guitars, violins, maybe some pianos. But at the same token, we don't always want everything to be in that range. That's just what's easiest, to hear, of course. And hopefully that will, spell itself out as you're creating. If everything is within that range, we don't have anything in the bass frequencies, we want certain things in the mids, obviously, right? Now, the middle ear consists of the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. The eardrum vibrates sympathetically within the incoming sound wave. So, for example, a loud instrument played towards the head of a drum will cause the drum to vibrate without being struck. And so, for anyone that's ever had a drummer friend or anything like that, and if the bass is warming up, before a gig or something, you hear the rattle of the snare. It's kind of the same idea, right? So it's vibrating sympathetically within the incoming sound wave. So, for example, if something hit your ear hard enough, you could break your eardrum, right? And so if something happens and if we rupture our eardrum and we damage our eardrum in the way that, let's say it starts bleeding or something, and, I've seen it before, you go to the doctor and then really there isn't much that you can do. And it's very, very sad, of course, especially if you're in the music business. It happened a lot in the 80s because they weren't necessarily protecting people in the studios, for example. At this point now, if you work in a recording studio, in a professional studio, you can only work in the room so loud, or it's considered detrimental to your health. And then, there's unions that will protect against that. And of course, you can complain that you're working in the environment. It's hazardous to your ears. And, you could definitely get compensated. So at this point, there is protection. But let's just say, in the 70s and the 80s, that really wasn't thought about. And a lot of people were having problems with, let's say, really loud transient sounds, things like that, maybe something feeding back or something just out of nowhere, and then rupturing your eardrum. Very, very scary if that happens, especially if you're in the music business. Just remembering, of course, we've got to protect ourselves. And one of the things that I like to show too is the importance of having those earbuds. And something that I saw that was really sad is, for some that, in the, armed forces, there's a lot of lawsuits happening because of the same problem. They were giving out, protection that wasn't necessarily working. And so they were finding that a lot of the frequencies were, going through and damaging people's ears, and they were finding that it was because of the protection that they were given, and there was a huge problem. And so one of the things I like to point out is the importance of taking care of our ears, of course. Now, the inner ear consists of the cochlea. The cochlea is a fluid-filled tube that's coiled up like a snail, and the fluid in the cochlea vibrates and converts the vibrations into neural impulses that are sent through the auditory nerve to the brain. Now, this is very important, especially for someone that has, let's say, for example, if you have allergies. And one of the things I like to think about is the importance of consistency. And so as we're pointing out all of these different things and these aspects of how our hearing works, one of the things I like to point out is what can happen when we start perceiving things, wrong. I had issues with allergies, and I had to be very consistent about what I do in terms of my allergies, because if fluid builds up within your nose, it builds up in your ears as well. And so, one of the things that I was having was called eustachian tube dysfunction. And so what was happening is that, obviously your nose and your ears are connected, and I was getting that fluid buildup. And so I was actually losing hearing on one side versus the other. That was a really bad thing as far as, of course, localizing sound in terms of panning, and of course a really bad thing in terms of, just being able to, mix, volume in general, right? So one of the things that I was able to do is, we were able to get some nasal sprays. I take, obviously various medication, and I do that, religiously at this point. And if I don't do it, if I change anything, I feel like I'm skewing the way that I hear. So we want to make sure that we definitely keep ourselves, consistent about what we're doing. And one of the things that happens, maybe as you get older, you'll find that you get certain allergies, or allergies get worse. Be conscious of that. It was something that definitely happened to myself and many of our friends, because if we get that fluid buildup, we might run into issues with the sound source going to our brain not necessarily being what is being perceived by our clients or by our fans. Another thing I like to point out is hearing loss. Hearing loss. Age and exposure to loud sounds cause the cochlea to become gradually less receptive to high frequencies, and that happens to all of us, of course. So one thing I like to do, of course, is to mix at a very low level, and if I can, I try to mix at a point where you could almost have a conversation over where you're mixing, because then, of course, if you're listening to something and you feel like you need to bring more bass out if it's at a low level, you're going to bring it out. If you're listening to something and you feel like you need more presence, you're going to bring out more of the mids or more of the high frequencies. But if you're listening too loud, imagine, you may actually push back at those frequencies or try to turn those frequencies down. And that might actually hurt the mix. And so listening to something too loud, working too loud is a very, very dangerous thing, I think. We want to be very careful about doing that. So as far as hearing loss, one of the things, again, noting that this is obviously something that's going to happen to all of us, of course. But one thing I also like to point out is that, and maybe you guys have the same thing, we have friends that are in sports, and 30, 40 years old, you can't play sports anymore. Boy, I tell you, I've got friends in the 80s, 90s, 100 that still are in the music business doing as well. So if we take care of our hearing, it doesn't necessarily go away to the point where we can't use it. In fact, I know some people that hear better than I do, and they're in the 70s and 80s. And so with that, the summary, very simple. A musical instrument creates compression waves that are modified by a resonator, and they move through the air. That's how we hear them. Electronic instruments have an oscillator or multiple oscillators that are amplified to create sound. The outer ear locates sound source and emphasizes frequencies between 2000 and 5000, essentially, mid-highs. And the middle eardrum vibrates sympathetically with the sound source and vibrates the inner ear. The inner ear translates the vibrations from the eardrum into neural impulses that are sent to the brain. And with that, this is really that simple as far as our first module. Everything that you see here will be on a quiz. The quiz will be very, very simple. And feel free to take that quiz as many times as you wish. Everything that you see, will be there essentially. There's just going to be, a few questions, nothing to it. Most importantly, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm always available for you. I'm really excited to get started here, guys, and please let me know if you need anything. Take care.